The village of Branton rested quietly between low hills and a narrow river that froze only in the coldest years. Most winters passed gently there. Frost would cover the roofs in the mornings, and thin ice would form along the edges of the water, but by midday the sun usually softened everything again. Snow came rarely and never stayed long. People spoke of harsher winters from decades ago, but those stories felt distant, like something that belonged to another time. So the people of Branton lived without urgency. They cut only enough firewood for a few weeks at a time. Grain was sold quickly after harvest instead of stored. Blankets were brought out only when the air turned cold enough to remind them where they had been kept all year. Winter was treated like a visitor who never stayed long. Except by Elias. Elias lived at the far end of the village road where the houses thinned into scattered plots of land. His home was small and plain, built of old timber darkened by years of weather. Behind the house stood a long, narrow shed that had once belonged to his father. Most people remembered Elias as quiet even when he was young. He spoke little, worked steadily, and kept to routines that rarely changed. After his parents passed away, he continued living alone, maintaining the same small property without expanding it or improving its appearance. But over the years, something about his land began to change. It started with firewood. At first, no one paid attention. Every household stacked logs somewhere near their homes. It was normal preparation for colder nights. But Elias kept stacking. He cut wood during spring when others repaired fences. He cut wood during summer when others harvested early crops. He cut wood in autumn long after most villagers had already filled their sheds. He split each log carefully and stacked them in long rows beneath the extended roof of his shed. When that space filled, he built another covered section beside it. Then another. By the second year, the stacks reached higher than a man's shoulders. By the third year, they stretched nearly the entire length of his property. People began noticing. One afternoon near the village well, a group of men watched Elias pass by pulling a cart loaded with fresh-cut logs. "How many winters does he think are coming?" one of them joked. "Enough to outlive us all," another replied, drawing laughter. Elias did not react. He walked steadily past them, boots leaving faint marks in the dust. The wood was only the beginning. Later that year, Elias reinforced the walls of his storage shed with thick wooden planks. He sealed gaps where wind once slipped through. He raised the floors several inches above ground level using stone blocks. Then sacks of grain began appearing inside. Unlike the others, Elias did not sell most of his harvest. Instead, he stored it. Wheat, barley, dried beans, potatoes packed in sand-filled crates. Each sack was marked carefully with charcoal dates. One of the merchants passing through the village once asked why he kept so much instead of selling when prices were high. Elias answered simply, "Prices change. Winter does not." The merchant shook his head and moved on. By the following autumn, Elias added something new. Blankets. Thick wool blankets hung in the sun during warm afternoons before being folded and carried into the shed. Old ones repaired with careful stitching. New ones purchased whenever traders came through. Soon there were stacks of them, more than any single man could ever need. Children noticed first. They wandered near his fence sometimes, whispering to each other and counting rows of firewood or peeking through gaps in the boards of his shed. One evening a boy asked him directly, "Are you expecting a war?" Elias smiled faintly, but said nothing. The seasons passed quietly. Another mild winter came and went with little more than frost and a few nights of cold wind. Snow fell once and melted by morning. Spring returned as usual, and with it came more wood, more grain, more blankets. The jokes became sharper. At the tea stall near the crossroads, men spoke openly now. "He lives like the world is ending. He wastes good money on fear. You cannot prepare forever." Someone once said, "When he dies, we'll all stay warm for 10 winters." The laughter that followed carried down the road. Elias continued working. Late one autumn afternoon, he climbed the low ridge west of the village. From there he could see the river winding through the valley and the narrow road that connected Branton to the nearest town. Cold air moved differently that day, sharper. He stood still for a long time, watching clouds gather in slow, heavy layers across the sky. The wind carried a smell he remembered from childhood, dry and metallic. Snow. Real snow. Not the thin kind that vanished by noon. The kind that stayed. The kind that buried roads. The kind that turned quiet villages into isolated islands. When Elias returned home, He worked until darkness. He checked the wood stacks and tightened the coverings against moisture. He reinforced the shed doors with an extra beam. He sealed the last cracks in the walls with packed clay and cloth. That night the temperature dropped faster than usual. Frost formed thick along the edges of the windows. And before dawn, the first snow began to fall. At first it looked harmless, light flakes drifting silently through the dark. But by morning, the ground was already hidden, and the sky showed no sign of clearing. By the third day, the road to Branton disappeared. Snow fell without pause, layer upon layer, burying the narrow dirt track beneath a smooth white surface that looked untouched and endless. The hills surrounding the village faded into pale shapes, and the river slowed until thick ice locked it in place. At first, people treated the snowfall like an inconvenience. Children played in the drifts near their homes. Men shoveled paths between houses. Women joked about how long it might last. But by the end of the first week, the mood had changed. Snow now reached halfway up the doors of smaller houses. The path to the well had to be cleared every morning. Livestock required constant care just to survive the cold nights. Still, most believed it would pass soon. Winter had never stayed long in Branton. It never had. The second week brought colder nights. Fires burned longer in every home. Wood stacks shrank faster than expected. Smoke hung low across the village in the still air, forming a gray layer that lingered between rooftops. Men began cutting fresh wood from nearby groves, but snow made the work slow and exhausting. Wet logs burned poorly, producing more smoke than heat. Inside homes, people began wearing blankets even during the day. The third week brought silence. No traders arrived. No travelers passed along the buried road. The village was alone. That realization settled heavily over Branton. Without regular trade, supplies became fixed. Whatever each household possessed would have to last until the thaw. And the thaw had not yet begun. By the fourth week, the first shortages appeared. One family ran out of dry firewood and began burning broken furniture. Another rationed food quietly, hoping no one would notice. The well path froze overnight, turning into a dangerous slope where several villagers slipped and fell. The cold deepened steadily. Night temperatures dropped lower than anyone could remember. Frost formed thick layers inside window frames. Water buckets froze solid before morning. People began speaking in worried tones now. How much longer can this last? No winter stays this long. It will warm soon. But the sky remained a dull, endless gray. Snow continued falling in slow, steady waves. And then came the night the temperature dropped below anything Branton had known. The cold arrived suddenly, like a door opening. Wind cut through every gap in the houses. Fires struggled to keep pace. Even thick blankets felt thin against the air. Before dawn, one of the village's oldest men was found barely conscious beside a dying fire. He survived, but the message spread quickly. This winter was not normal. That afternoon, a group of villagers walked toward Elias's property. They had noticed the smoke rising from his chimney every morning and every night, steady, strong, never weakening. They found him outside splitting wood as calmly as if it were early autumn. One of the men spoke first. "How much do you have stored?" Elias paused, resting the axe against a stump. "Enough." The answer irritated them. "We're asking seriously." "So am I." Another man stepped forward. "We need to know if this will last." Elias looked at the snow-covered hills beyond the village. "It will last longer than you think." The words unsettled them. "How do you know?" He hesitated before answering. "I remember the winter when I was a boy. The river froze solid enough for carts to cross. Snow stayed until planting season." One of the men shook his head. "That was 50 years ago." Elias nodded. "Yes." They waited for him to say more. He did not. Over the following days, people watched his house more closely. Smoke continued rising steadily from the chimney. No frantic cutting of wet wood. No hurried repairs. No signs of shortage. Inside his shed, stacks remained high. Higher than anyone had imagined. Meanwhile, conditions worsened. Another week passed. Several homes ran dangerously low on fuel. The groves near the village had already been stripped of easy wood. Remaining trees stood farther away, beyond deep drifts that made travel slow and risky. Food supplies began tightening as well. Meals grew smaller, bread thinner, soup more watery. For the first time, the elders gathered not to discuss the weather, but survival. Voices were tense. "We must ration." We already are. What if this continues another month? Silence followed. Everyone knew what that would mean. Late that evening, as the temperature dropped once again, a young mother knocked on Elias's door. She held a small bundle of sticks in her arms. It was all she had left. "My children are cold," she said quietly. Elias stepped aside without hesitation. Inside, the room was warm. Not overly warm, but steady and safe. He filled her arms with dry logs and handed her 2 folded blankets from a nearby stack. She tried to speak, but could not. Word spread by morning. Soon others came. At first a few, then many, standing quietly outside his shed, staring at what they once mocked. Rows upon rows of stacked firewood, shelves of grain, bundles of blankets. Enough to outlast the winter that had trapped them all. And as another storm rolled in that evening, burying what little remained of the road beneath fresh drifts, the villagers understood something for the first time. If Elias had prepared only for himself, he would have survived comfortably. But the rest of Branton would not. The line outside Elias's shed formed quietly the next morning. No one pushed forward. No one argued. The villagers stood in the pale winter light with lowered voices and careful patience, boots pressed deep into packed snow. Smoke rose slowly from chimneys across Branton, thinner now than before, fading quickly into the gray sky. Elias opened the shed doors as he did every morning. The hinges creaked in the cold. Inside, the stacks stood exactly as they had for years. Orderly rows of split wood reaching toward the beams, sacks of grain piled carefully along the walls, crates of dried food raised above the floor, and blankets folded into neat columns. Preparation made visible. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Elias stepped aside and said simply, "1 bundle each." The system formed naturally after that. Each household received wood enough for several days. Grain was measured and distributed in small sacks. Blankets were given first to families with children and the elderly. No one argued with the order. The seriousness of the winter had stripped away pride that once would have made such sharing difficult. Days passed in quiet routine. Each morning Elias opened the shed. Each evening, he checked what remained. The stacks slowly lowered, but never dangerously. The careful years of preparation revealed themselves not as excess, but as calculation. He had planned for more than one winter. Now that planning carried the village through a single one. Outside, the storms continued. Snow no longer fell in dramatic waves, but in steady drifting layers that deepened the silence around Branton. The road remained buried beyond recognition. Hills and fields blended into one continuous white landscape, where direction became uncertain and distance impossible to judge. Time itself felt slower. Weeks passed with little change. But something inside the village had shifted. Men who once laughed now worked beside Elias when weather allowed, splitting additional wood from the few remaining dry logs stored under his extended roof. Others repaired damaged roofs or reinforced doors against the wind. Women organized shared cooking so that fuel burned more efficiently. Older children helped clear the path to the well each morning before the ice hardened. Survival became collective. The winter no longer belonged to individuals. It belonged to the village. One evening, near the middle of the second month, the temperature dropped again, lower than before. The cold pressed inward against every wall and door. Even strong fires struggled to hold back the air that seeped through small, unseen cracks. That night the village stayed awake longer than usual. Wind howled through the valley, carrying sharp grains of ice that rattled against shutters and boards. Snow piled higher against doorways. Several families gathered together in shared rooms where warmth could be preserved. Elias walked outside once before midnight. The sky was clear for the first time in weeks, revealing hard bright stars above the frozen valley. The snow reflected faint light across the land, turning everything pale and still. He stood listening. The wind sounded weaker. Different. He watched the horizon for a long time before returning inside. 3 days later, the change became visible. The sun appeared briefly through thin clouds, casting a brightness that felt unfamiliar after weeks of gray. Snow along the southern walls of houses softened slightly by midday. Thin drops of water fell from roof edges before freezing again overnight. It was not spring. Not yet. But the grip of winter had begun to loosen. The following week, the first section of the buried road reappeared where wind had scoured the surface clean. Travelers from the nearest town arrived cautiously, bringing news that many villages had struggled through the same winter. Some had lost livestock. Others had been forced to abandon homes temporarily. Branton had survived. Word of Elias's preparations spread quickly among the visitors. Some spoke of it with surprise, others with quiet respect. When the thaw finally came in earnest, it arrived slowly but steadily. Snow receded from fields in uneven patches. The river broke open with heavy cracking sounds as ice drifted downstream in thick slabs. Mud replaced snow along the roads, and familiar shapes of land emerged again after weeks of disappearance. Life resumed its motion. Repairs began. Fields were inspected. Animals were led back into open air. But one thing did not return to the way it had been before. That spring, stacks of fresh cut wood began appearing beside nearly every house in Branton. Not small piles, large ones. Sheds were repaired and extended. Grain storage rooms were reinforced. Blankets were aired in the sunlight and folded carefully away. Preparation became habit. Late one afternoon, as the last patches of snow melted along the hillside, an elder walked with Elias toward the edge of the village. For a while they said nothing. Then the elder spoke. "You saved this place." Elias shook his head slightly. "No." The elder looked at him. "You prepared," Elias said. "The winter did the rest." They stood watching the river flow freely again. Months earlier, the village had believed winter was temporary, something that always passed easily, something that required little thought. Now they understood differently. Seasons change without warning. Hard years arrive without permission, and survival often depends on work done long before danger appears. As the evening sun lowered across Branton, light reflected from new wood stacks beside homes throughout the village. The preparations had already begun again, even with warm days returning. Because the lesson of that winter would not fade quickly, the villagers now understood something they once ignored. Waiting for danger is easy. Prepare